Welcome to Passionate World Talk Radio. Educate, enlighten, and entertain. I'm Shannon Zeman, and thank you for joining us on the most important 15 minutes of your day, where we share expert information on safety and preparedness that you can use in your everyday life. It's natural to feel afraid during and after a traumatic situation. Our fight, flight, or freeze responses to fear trigger so many split-second changes in our body to help defend us against danger or to avoid it. Most people will experience a range of reactions after trauma, but most of us recover from these symptoms naturally. Individuals who continue to experience problems may be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD develops in some people who have experienced a shocking, scary, or dangerous event. It's amazing how one traumatic experience can change your life's purpose. So today joining me is Linda Stanley, a retired Air Force officer who was deployed to Iraq in 2006 as a trauma nurse. Linda previously worked in the emergency psychiatric clinic, specializing in PTSD assessment and treatment. She is currently a psychiatric nurse practitioner at a residential treatment facility designed to promote recovery in veterans, particularly those returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. Linda has dedicated her life to helping those struggling with PTSD and has spoken nationally on the topic of PTSD to numerous professional groups. So thank you, Linda, so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So I'm really excited to have you here because I did not know a lot about PTSD until I was actually diagnosed with it. And I think that if people can understand this more, they can identify so that they can help themselves and others with it. So could you explain what PTSD is exactly?
Sure. So I always like to think of PTSD is not what's wrong with you. It's kind of what happened to you. And so when we look at diagnosing, we actually moved PTSD from anxiety disorder to its own category on its own called trauma stress-related disorders. And the first thing you always have to look at is a person has to be exposed to a trauma. And that trauma could be many things. It could be a tsunami. It can be combat, which most people associate PTSD with.
Right.
It can be illness, a severe illness. It can be abuse, whether it's a rape or domestic violence. But they have to really experience the event for themselves, or they have to witness it to be diagnosed with PTSD. It can be someone who you know that's very close that has an unexpected death. And they actually added 2 categories in this last revision of the DSM. One is the first responders, so police officers, people who see trauma day in and day out. And then a preschool category for children who've been abused, domestic, violence. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I think that's I would always think that first responders, like nurses, doctors, firemen, police officers, all them would have been in there. It's surprising they weren't in there before.
Yeah, they actually, a lot changed after 9/11 because people were saying they got PTSD from watching things on TV, and they actually had to make sure that they spelled it out specifically about first responders. And then when you go down the criteria, you have to, most people who've been exposed to a trauma, like you and your husband in a shooting, for that first month will have many of the symptoms that PTSD has in it. So they actually don't diagnose you till it's been at least a month afterwards. And it has to affect some kind of either occupational or relationships in your life. It has to do some kind of effect on your overall health.
Oh, well, that's really interesting.
And then they start looking at, there's 4 criteria that they look at.
Okay.
So one is re-experiencing, whether that's through nightmares or feeling like you've been there or flashbacks.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the intrusive thoughts, things that you can't stop thinking about it. And that could be, where you're reminded or triggered by something that
Mm-hmm.
makes you think of that and you can't get it out of your mind.
Okay.
Then there's avoidance, where people do everything they can not to think about it. So that can be in many different ways. That can be in substance abuse, alcohol or drugs, trying to avoid those thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
It can be like not returning to specific areas, or, like watching movies that are associated with the trauma. So there's a lot of avoidance. That's a lot of times people handle it by avoiding. And then there's parts of it like an inability to remember things, negative thoughts or changes in your own psyche. You think the world's all bad. You have guilt sometimes.
Mm.
You blame yourself for a lot of things. So we look at those criteria, and usually probably the number one symptom that most people have is in the arousal category, meaning with arousal, they find themselves not being able to sleep. And that's probably the signature symptom that most people experience. They might have irritability. They might have that startled response where they're hypervigilant. Everything affects them. And so we look at those 4 categories and we decide they have a trauma. It's been over a month, and then you're diagnosed with PTSD.
Mm. And, it's really interesting how you break those down, because us being at Route 91 and the mass shooting, as you're talking about those, I can identify my friends, because we were all affected differently. And that's what I think is really interesting. There's no cookie cutter, as you're explaining.
And a lot of people won't admit, especially I find that in the veteran community or even the police officers, there's a stigma that's associated with PTSD or any kind of mental health issues. And so they avoid and keep avoiding, and the avoidance only perpetuates those PTSD symptoms. Some become workaholics, some become alcoholics, and some become drugs. And they start distancing themselves from a lot of things that they care about.
Right. And I think, and humans aren't made to take on trauma like that. And so I think that's great that it's becoming, I don't know, the word is not right, but more okay, right? That
it's more accepted.
Thank you. That's the word I was looking for.
That people realize that trauma is not just a psychological thing, it's a physiological thing that affects your brain when you're exposed to traumas. And it can actually change, how you feel and react and kind of your whole life.
Yes. I really think, and I never looked negatively on anybody that had it, but it's just like anything. You don't really understand it until you experience it, and you hope people don't have to experience it, but it definitely opens an eye. And that's why I love that you're here talking about it and kind of, pulling back the curtain on this. So
I was going to say the goal is always that you're not going to ever forget about traumas, but it shouldn't run your life.
Mm-hmm.
It should be where it doesn't tell you everything to do in your life. So there's a lot of different ways that we treat PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
There's things called evidence-based, which we know works because it's been tested over years and years and years. And there's 3 evidence-based treatments for PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
One is called prolonged exposure, where you actually kind of relive the trauma in detail. And you record it and you listen to it over and over and over. Another one is called cognitive processing trauma, where you CPT, you'll hear people say it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you actually write out usually the trauma in detail and kind of process it. And then there's another one called EMDR, where you actually do some exposure to help you as you're processing it with whether lights or a finger or sound, where you're stimulating both the right side and left side of the brain. Those are the evidence-based, but we found through a lot of research that there's a lot of other things that work, such as alternative treatments, such as yoga and meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And service dogs. I'm sure a lot of the people out there have seen service dogs with individuals that help with the hypervigilant and the triggers.
Right.
Uh, art and music,
Mm.
and then there's a lot of different therapies that help people, such as moral injury and acceptance therapy. So all of those things, like you said, it's not a cookie cutter. Each person's an individual, and
Right.
each person's going to figure out how, with the help, hopefully, of some mental health providers, and not have it run the rest of their life.
Yes.
Yes.
So I think that's really interesting how you're talking about the evidence base and then the alternative treatments, because we think of especially the alternative treatments more as just self-care, but I believe self-care is part of dealing with PTSD or anything kind of traumatic or stressful in our lives. And a lot of times we put that on the back burner. So I definitely think healing our minds and our body is all part of it, right? We just can't go to one person to fix it. It's a full body experience.
There's a whole session that we could talk about moral injury that we don't even touch in, because a lot of people suffer from guilt, whether guilt at a concert, or guilt that I didn't do anything or I didn't react. So we're finding a lot as time goes on, especially with these last 2 wars lasting so long, that there's many ways of treating PTSD.
And I think that's so wonderful. And I am so excited that you're going to join us time and time again to talk about all this, because I think we're really going to be able to open eyes for people that don't have an understanding of PTSD. So then they're more forgiving of people dealing with it. And then hopefully help people possibly realize that they might be struggling with PTSD and how to get that help. So I love that. And Linda, is there any specific takeaway as we close today's podcast that you would like to share?
Yeah, I'd like to say, both myself being in Iraq and you and your husband being in a shooting, people have to find their purpose again. And we talk about that with post-traumatic growth.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way of adjusting, having a more of a positive influence when people go through a traumatic experience.
Yeah.
And that's what we kind of want. We want, there's things that I learned from being in combat, how precious life is and how I don't take it for granted, and things are just things. And post-traumatic growth is something that hopefully people with trauma in their life experience after therapy.
So excited that you're going to come back and talk about post-traumatic growth, because I would say I didn't realize it, but I have PTSD from my breast cancer, from the diagnosis and all that. And I went into warrior mode, right? Like, I'm not going to worry about myself. How can I help others? And then Troy and I did the same thing when we were at Route 91 for the mass shooting. Seeking help for yourself, tending to yourself, taking care of yourself is then going to, in essence, give you those tools to help others. So I'm really excited about, we all need to grow in some fashion, but post-traumatic growth, I think, it will be able to affect anybody. So I'm really, really excited about that. And thank you so much for being here.
I enjoyed it. Yes, we have lots to talk about in the future. So I really appreciate what you and your husband are doing as far as bringing to light that trauma can happen and that we can do things with that trauma.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And that's what we're here for, just trying to educate and help people. So next week, Kelly Sayer is going to be returning to join me, and we're going to be talking about the importance of setting and enforcing boundaries, because I can set my boundaries all the time, but enforcing them is really hard. So Kelly and I are going to discuss that next week. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here and listening to Passionate World Talk Radio. You have just been listening to the most important 15 minutes of your day with me, Shannon Zeman. And you can find and listen to my podcast anywhere you find your podcasts. Remember, with knowledge, you have the power.